York on this day 880 of the Trump administration, with 581 days remaining in his term. Donald Trump officially kicked off his re-election campaign with a rally in Orlando tonight. He spoke for 1 hour, 18 minutes. As he left the White House, he commented on the departure of our acting defense secretary, already replaced with a new acting defense secretary, at a time when 1,000 more U.S. troops are en route to the Gulf amid these tensions with Iran. Patrick Shanahan, who had been running the Pentagon, is out. Mark Esper, who has been Secretary of the Army, is the new acting Secretary of Defense. The backstory is rather ugly. The announcement came within minutes of a Washington Post report that outlined alleged domestic violence incidents within Shanahan's family. We'll have more on this story in a moment, but first, the president has wrapped up this rally in Orlando tonight, where he delivered his message to diehard supporters.
Our patriotic movement has been under assault from the very first day. We accomplished more than any other president has in the first 2.5 years of a presidency, and under circumstances that no president has had to deal with before, because we did, in the middle of the great and illegal witch hunt, things that nobody have been able to accomplish, not even close. Nobody's done what we have done in 2.5 years.
President also wasted no time going after Democrats.
Our radical Democrat opponents are driven by hatred, prejudice, and rage. They want to destroy you, and they want to destroy our country as we know it. Not acceptable. It's not going to happen.
The president left the stage tonight, as usual, to the music of the Rolling Stones. You can't always get what you want. Before he took the stage, thousands of Trump supporters took part in what the campaign called 45 Fest outside of the Amway Center there in Orlando. Our own Monica Alba asked a number of the Trump tailgaters what they were thinking ahead of the 2020 election.
He has done very well in the economic area, very well in the job-creating area, superb in the military, enhancing the military, helping the vets with the VA system. Just so many things. It's hard to remember them all.
Any concerns about who he may face in 2020 and the Democratic opponents?
So far, out of the 24 or so that they're putting up, I have no concerns whatsoever. I mean, socialism hasn't worked anywhere in the world. So why would you want to propose that for here?
Any disappointments or frustrations?
No, none at all. None at all. I hope we have the next 4 with him, and then after that, I hope his son runs.
Also, before the president's rally, the Orlando Sentinel editorial board offered a unique non-endorsement as the president campaigned in their backyard today. Quote, "Some readers will wonder how we could possibly eliminate a candidate so far before an election and before knowing the identity of his opponent, because there's no point pretending we would ever recommend that readers vote for Trump. After 2.5 years, we've seen enough. Enough of the chaos, the division, the schoolyard insults, the self-aggrandizement, the corruption, and especially the lies." The president arrived to more bad news in Florida in the form of a new Quinnipiac poll. The poll of Florida voters shows Biden beating Trump by 9, Sanders by 6, Warren by 4, and so on. Meanwhile, as we mentioned back in Washington, a lot of people were caught by surprise today when Patrick Shanahan took his name out of consideration to be the permanent Secretary of Defense. The Washington Post reports that in the months he has served as Trump's acting defense secretary, Shanahan has worked to keep domestic violence incidents within his family private. The Post reports, quote, "His wife was arrested after punching him in the face, and his son was arrested after a separate incident in which he hit his mother with a baseball bat. Public disclosure of the nearly decade-old episodes would re-traumatize his young adult children," Shanahan said. Shanahan spoke publicly about the incidents in interviews with the Washington Post on Monday and Tuesday. "Bad things can happen to good families, and this is a tragedy, really," Shanahan said. Dredging up the episode publicly, he said, "will ruin my son's life." The Post cites court and police records from Florida and Seattle about the incidents cited in their report. We should note NBC News has not seen those same documents. Earlier today, President Trump said Shanahan has decided not to move forward with the confirmation process so he can spend more time with his family. Again, the president was asked about Shanahan before departing for Florida this afternoon.
You asked Shanahan to withdraw?
No, I didn't. I didn't ask him to withdraw, but he walked in this morning. He said it's going to be a rough time for him because of obviously what happened. But I did not ask him to withdraw. He presented me with a letter this morning. That was his decision. I had heard about it yesterday for the first time. I didn't know about it. I had heard about it yesterday, and it's very unfortunate. Very unfortunate.
NBC News reports that while it's not clear when Trump learned about these issues, White House aides and other officials in the administration have known about the alleged domestic issues in Shanahan's past for some time. This news, of course, comes amid high tensions in the Middle East. The United States blaming Iran for attacks on 2 tankers in the Gulf of Oman just last week. Iran continues to deny any responsibility for the incidents. Here with our leadoff discussion on a Tuesday night, we welcome back Peter Baker, Chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, Robert Costa, national political reporter for the Washington Post and moderator of Washington Week on PBS, and Annie Carney, White House reporter with the New York Times, who is in Florida, fresh from tonight's rally. Annie, I'd like to begin with you because of the event you attended tonight. It seemed like a perfectly stirring kickoff of his campaign against Hillary Clinton. We say that because there were 7 Hillary mentions, 1 Bill mention, and 1 extended lock her up chant. What couldn't we see on TV? We did see on your social media that the crowd was entertained by a replay of election night coverage 2016 on Fox News. How did this event differ in any regal sense from the usual Trump rally?
It didn't. There was no new message unveiled tonight. There was no new theory of the case presented about what Donald Trump would do with the second term. The hats were the same. The campaign slogan was the same. The playlist was virtually the same. As I tweeted, the entertainment before he got there was a replay of Fox calling states on election night 2016, and the crowd was cheering and loved it. And again, he attacked Hillary Clinton more often. I think he made 1 passing reference to Joe Biden and 1 passing reference to Bernie Sanders. So one of my takeaways was that he wants to relive 2016, and his supporters were there to relive it with him. It kind of felt like a blast from the past. But in terms of a relaunch, he filed the paperwork for his reelection campaign on the day of his inauguration, and it was a larger rally. It was a campaign rally on steroids, but this was just another rally, the same kind of MAGA rallies he's been staging for 2.5 years.
So, Robert Costa, it does sound like we're going to relitigate from top to bottom. It sounds like good doses of anger, resentment, and grievances. Any tone or content that you noted was different from 2016 in any serious way?
It was an escalation of the president's populism that he used in 2016. It was not red versus blue tonight in Orlando. It was us versus them, framing his entire political movement as a victim of these forces beyond his control that are out there, that are ominous, from a, quote, flood of migrants to, quote, radical Democrats, socialists. This is how the president was framing the opposition, and he was rallying his core voters to stick with him, to provide him with that lift in some of these key states throughout the industrial Midwest and elsewhere, places in the South like Florida, to make sure they come out. And this was, he would stay on script, Brian, when he was talking through his talking points, his litany of his record over the past 2.5 years. But when he went off script, it was all about populism in a raw sense. Nothing that was really scripted. It was punching at enemies perceived. And the Republican Party was right there with him. Senator Rubio, Senator Scott, Senator Graham in the crowd, camera shots of them laughing and cheering as the president went on these riffs. That's a snapshot of the Republican Party today.
And Peter Baker, indeed, there were several notable sidebars. Number one, the president indicating, in his view, Lindsey Graham wasn't doing that well politically back home in South Carolina until Trump took him under his wing. Number two, still tough to get used to seeing Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the sitting White House press secretary, performing at a re-election rally for the president. How did tonight score, in your view, as a sales pitch, kind of what we've been talking about so far?
Well, look, this was President Trump's greatest hits. And if you have been a fan of his hits, this is going to stir you up and get you going again. But it was a repeat of 2016. It wasn't a new message, as Annie said. And I think Robert's exactly right about the Republican Party. The difference between 2016 and today, the difference between that Fox News clips that they were showing beforehand and the red hats and all of the things we've gotten used to from 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, is he does now control this Republican Party. This is Donald Trump's party. Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago at least, ran against him for the nomination and excoriated him, said he wasn't qualified to be president, said he was a con man. Both of them used that same phrase, con man. Today, he's showing them off in his rally, making clear that they now belong to the party of Trump. So does Sarah Huckabee Sanders. She may be the future of the party of Trump in a way. I mean, you pointed out that she takes the stage. He wants her to run for governor of Arkansas. That would be, of course, in 2022 when the seat next comes open. And that would be the next generation of Trump supporters if she were to run and were to win. So I think that, you know, the big difference between the last time and this time isn't the message, isn't the hats, isn't the music, but it is the Republican Party.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.